You see the supply chain disruption. It's happening all around us, every day. Survival means future-proofing and restructuring your supply chain for the challenges of today and tomorrow. Progress means moving from a linear supply chain that's only as strong as its weakest link to an interconnected, multi-dimensional supply network that's resilient, secure, and agile. That's where GEP can help. GEP software provides the infrastructure to build that resilient network. GEP Smart Procurement Software and GEP Next Supply Chain Management Software come together as the world's only complete and unified source-to-pay and supply chain management solution. Through the power of GEP Click, the cloud integration platform, GEP software integrates smoothly with legacy supply chain systems and ERPs. This means fast system setup and access to real-time data for actionable business intelligence. And GEP's user-first approach ensures the next generation of business software is intuitive and efficient. Imagine sitting in a control tower with a complete view of all your supply and demand, and all your spend and suppliers, ready to use for intelligent advantage. GEP offers the easiest way to build a multi-dimensional, interconnected supply chain that's resilient, secure, and agile. With a supply chain built on GEP, you can be more responsive, execute faster, pivot as needed, mitigate risk, survive, and flourish. Learn more, gep.com/software.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our discussion on supply chain collaboration and free trade as a counterbalance to inflation and disruption. There's a lot to unpack there. My name is John Ferguson, and I'm the practice lead for globalization, trade and finance at Economist Impact. Now, before I introduce our great panel here, I just want to set the scene a little bit. To give you some economic context, the global economy in 2020 saw a GDP contraction that was almost double what happened in the global financial crisis. So that tells you how severe the economic shock was in 2020. Now, we're a few months down the line now in 2021, but the global economy is still recovering. COVID is still here. Companies and countries and governments are still dealing with the uncertainty of COVID. Now, when we think about supply chain managers, procurement managers have had a very difficult task over the last 1 to 2 years. Not only was it complete markets shutting down, factories shutting down. So that obviously had a tremendous impact on the supply side of the supply chain. The supply chain managers also had to deal with the demand side. So when countries were going into lockdown, it's one thing having to deal with suppliers going into lockdown on your supply side, but what about your end markets? How long were lockdowns going to last? When were they going to open up? And now here we are in coming up towards the end of 2021, and those uncertainties are still there. COVID is still proving a challenge in many countries and many big markets around the world. So the disruption facing supply chains is really quite severe. And it's not just supply, but it's also the demand side as well. And then we've got inflation. Now, economists don't tend to agree on a lot, and they're having many disagreements right now about inflation. But inflation is 4 to 5% in some really key markets, really big markets around the world. And one of the questions I want to dig in with our great panel in a moment is, what's driving that inflation, and is it temporary or permanent? And that's a really big question. And it's the same thing for disruption. How temporary or permanent is that disruption as well? And then we get into the solutions and possible ways to deal with that inflation and disruption. But now let me introduce our great panel. We've got 3 great panelists joining us today. First, we have Pramod Gupta, Vice President of Consulting at GEP. Next, I'd like to introduce Moti Guillemlani, Global Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer at Ericsson. And last but not least, Lynn Terrell, Chief Supply Chain Officer at Flex. Now, Pramod, can I start with you, please? Let's talk about challenges for a while before we get to solutions. But in terms of challenges and the drivers of supply chain disruption, is it just COVID? Was that too much of a simple introduction that I gave? Is it more than COVID? From your point, Pramod, what do you think about the main drivers of supply chain disruption right now?
John, first of all, good morning, and thanks for having me on this panel, and great to be with other panelists here as well. What I have seen over the past 18 months is really the COVID related disruptions that clients have dealt with and are still trying to get out of it. What that has actually triggered is other disruptive forces like labor shortages. I was talking to a consumer food manufacturer just yesterday, and they have a couple of their manufacturing locations on strike right now because of the labor shortage issues. So that's causing quite a bit of shortage and disruption for them. And then I think the other major driver that I see, disruptive force that I see, is more from a structural standpoint, internal to supply chains, where companies have just limited or immature capabilities in how they interact with their stakeholders, functional stakeholders, not just internally, but also with their supply chain partners across their value chain, ranging from consumers to suppliers to contract manufacturers to third-party logistics providers, technology solution providers, and many other critical players in this global supply chain that we operate in now. So in my mind, a lot of it is triggered from COVID, but labor certainly is emerging to be a critical disruptor. And then the internal structures or lack of, I should say, are causing some disruptions in supply chain as well.
Absolutely. Moti, can I bring you in? Pramod talked about it's not just COVID, labour markets, internal structures. What about from your perspective, Moti?
I would say, I think I would start with COVID, right? So two things. When we were in COVID, it led to severe challenges. People were, depending on the country, right? If you look at a lot of the manufacturing is located in places like Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia. These countries, India, they went through a very severe period of factory shutdowns, and it definitely had an impact on supply. And as we have gone through it, as we have come back, I would argue there is a V-recovery, and suddenly there is severe logistical challenges, severe capacity shortages in those factories because of the V-recovery, right? So I would argue that the pandemic actually has played quite a bit of a role. However, I would say that it's a perfect storm. There are digitization and overall significant change in terms of technology, right? So if you look at people working from home, there was demand for more laptops. If you look at the hyperscale and everybody moving to the cloud is playing a role. Electrical vehicles, significantly growing. All of them, essentially, if you think about it, underpinning technology. So there is a significant sea shift in terms of how the industries are evolving and becoming more technology oriented, and that's putting more pressure on supply chains. And then you combine that with pandemic during and after. I think the combination is making things quite difficult for overall demand supply. And I would say it's a demand supply, and then combine that with logistics, with holiday coming. I think it has led to a perfect storm.
Absolutely, Moti. I sit in the UK. If I didn't mention that already, people are talking that we might not get our turkeys for Christmas. So this period, Thanksgiving in the US, Christmas in other markets around the world. I mean, supply chains and logistics for consumer goods, household things will be under a lot of pressure. Absolutely. Lynn, can I bring you in? More than COVID, labour markets, consumers and businesses focusing on things like technology products during COVID. What are some of the major drivers that you're seeing that are really disrupting supply chains?
Well, I think if we think about our historical supply chains, they've really been built on low-cost inefficiencies, and it's been decades in the making. And while COVID was certainly disruptive, I would say some of the changes to those global supply chains happened before COVID with the tariffs and trade tensions that were taking place. And then when COVID hit, as was said, we had, as Flex, we had all of our factories around the world shutting down, opening up, implementing social distancing and PPE protection and protecting our employees. And all of our customers and suppliers were doing the same thing around the world. And as Modi mentioned, there were significant increases in some demand in some sectors, while others we had decreases in requirements. And throughout 2020, I would describe it a bit more of a lack of visibility, because when we were going back to our suppliers asking them to reconfirm our orders, it took some time depending upon where they were in their, coming out of opening up after COVID. But we kind of got through the year, I would say quite well in managing through those turbulent times and working to keep our manufacturing running and supporting our customers and working very collaboratively with our customers and our suppliers. What we saw in 2021 was really where we started to experience the shortages, where demand just started outstripping supply. And it happened early in January, and I would say I've never seen anything like what we've had this year, because it's been one supply chain shock after another. If you think about the severe weather in Texas, earthquake in Japan, fires in factories around the world, the Suez Canal, further COVID outbreaks in Southeast Asia that are impacting already constrained suppliers, and now freight and logistics challenges, which is front page of the news. As Modi said, it's been a perfect storm that's impacted our supply chains, and all indications are saying that it's going to last a while until we see some recovery. So it's certainly been a challenging 2 years in supply chain.
Absolutely, Lynn. And that's actually the question I want to go on to now before I come back to the gentleman, Lynn. Is it temporary or permanent? I mean, we're all sitting here, we're all seeing these stories on the news. You're all right in the middle of it, managing your supply chains and dealing with these issues and working with clients. But one of the biggest questions is how long is the perfect storm going to last, Lynn? Is it temporary? Is it 3 months? Is it 2 months? Or really, are we here for the long haul? And that's, I think, a key question. I'd love to hear how you're viewing it, Lynn.
Well, I think in some of the critical shortage situations that we're dealing with today, we have shortages across the majority of our commodities, but there's a lot of focus on the semiconductor market right now. And indications are showing that we will see some relief in some additional output mid-22. In other categories, it could go well into 2023. And that's based on what we're seeing today from both a demand perspective and assuming there's not going to be another major shock to the supply chain. So I think we'll see that recovery starting. But what's also very interesting, as we're working with our customers and having a lot of dialogue, a lot of companies are looking at how to de-risk their supply chains. I mentioned previously, historically being built on low cost and efficiency. Well, now everybody's talking about agility, an agile and resilient supply chain. And those can be achieved through a variety of means, but there's cost associated with that. If some companies may absolutely feel a central globalized manufacturing strategy makes the most sense because of how they're able to take advantage of scale and scope and cost efficiencies, while other customers are looking at potentially moving some of their manufacturing closer to the end markets. And in doing that, it's not just the manufacturing, it's the supply chain associated with that. What products are able to be regionalized, but in some cases, the nuances and the realities of our business, not everything can be regionalized. So it will continue a very complex global supply chain. And my hope going forward is, supply chain professionals who are navigating this situation today look for ways to drive that agile and resilient supply chain and drive more collaboration and visibility into the entire ecosystem.
Absolutely, and hold that thought on collaboration and some of the responses. We'll get there very soon, so we'll definitely come back to that. Pramod, when we were discussing and preparing for this webinar, the question about how long is this perfect storm going to last took us a long time to discuss as we were preparing. Pramod, what's your expectations as you work with people and have these discussions? This perfect storm, Short term, medium term, long term? What do you think?
My view, John, is that the demand surge that companies are experiencing is relatively, in my view, is a short-term phenomenon. And when I say short-term, let me caveat that I think that's going to probably last for another 12, 18 months. And I was talking to another client of mine yesterday, and he mentioned this term called revenge spending, that all of us who have been sort of strapped in our households and have not been able to go out and spend our monies on things we like to do. Now, with economy opening up and people becoming free again to move around, I think there is this sort of wave of revenge spending that is creating a spike in demand, which I think will eventually certainly level off, but perhaps will level off at a higher level than what we had seen pre-COVID, but it will certainly level off. In my view, what's going to be permanent, and I think, Lynn, you said it, is the need for a resilient supply chain, right? The need to be able to stay connected with your partners, supply chain partners, both upstream and downstream. And so I see that to be a permanent impact of the supply chain disruption, John.
That's fascinating, Pramod. I've just written down revenge spending. I might use that in my own work. So thanks very much for sharing that phrase. I think you're right. The sort of permanence. Maybe there's one small positive out of this crisis, that people will be focusing on resilience and putting more effort into that. We'll get into how in maybe 5 or 10 minutes. But Modi, I just want to come to you just on the sort of temporal nature here. Are you expecting short-term fixes? Are you expecting a long haul here of the perfect storm as you described a few minutes ago?
I would say short term for quite a few things, but so if you look at copper has gone up 50%, aluminum 60%, oil back to pre-COVID, right? So if you look at the level of change is unprecedented, right? It's really a very short span. I think everything has gone through the roof. So my expectation is that a lot of this should come back. But I'll tell you what I feel concerned about, right? And where I think it'll go longer. Semiconductor, it'll go longer because across industry, look at healthcare, look at automotive, look at consumer goods. There's very little today that can be done without semiconductor. So and I forgot hyperscale, right? The level of consumption of semiconductor is just going through the roof, right? Capacities takes about 2 years for them to come. So it's going to be time before a balance can be brought in the supply chain. So expect end of 22, and then some of them actually 23, when we will likely see the relief. Second thing, I think with this infrastructure bill, which is just got signed, $1.2 trillion infrastructure. If you look at the nuances of that, it's got electric vehicle infrastructure, it's got the road construction and other. There will be ancillary products that will certainly have, again, higher. It's a significant investment a very large country has decided to put, right? So that would again strain some of the supply chain. So I see some relief, but then I expect as more and more money gets invested, pick up again and a demand supply imbalance, and I see semiconductor perhaps hanging around for a little longer till the capacities can come in place.
Absolutely, Modi. I think if we add your excellent point about the infrastructure bill there in the US to Pramod's point about revenge spending, that's a lot of spending coming. And I wanted to ask you, and I want to ask Pramod and Lynn in a moment too, but Modi, staying with you, inflation, can you, if we've got all this spending going on, like as a macroeconomist, that is going to put pressure on inflation. But more from the supply chain perspective, I don't want to bore people with macroeconomics in this conversation, but more from the supply chain conversation, how is that a challenge? How does understanding inflation and seeing inflation rise and fall at different rates in your markets, how does that put pressure on supply chain managers and people in procurement?
I think it does, right? And I'm going to borrow back what Lynn talked about, right? The supply chains historically were built, I would say, perfectly, because we are a capitalist society. Ultimately, every business is out there to produce outstanding quality technology and at the right cost. and that invariably the globalization led for people to go identify suppliers, where the best suppliers are, with the best cost structure, quality, technology, right? And countries, if you think on their own, were trying to excel and wanted to become the destination of choice, right? They wanted to be the one that we would go buy from. And what it has led over last 20 to 30 years, 60% of the world trade happens with 5 countries, right? It's China being 30%, 28.7%, about 30% being China, right? So the dependence has shifted. We have 200 plus countries in the world, five controlling 60%, one country controlling 29%. That's a lot of spend, a lot of dependence, right? And so I think that the economies have moved for competitive cost, and it's great for consumer because ultimately consumers enjoy those low prices. But what is beginning to happen, I think we have all learned through this pandemic, right, that there's so many things out of your control. We talked about factory fires, we talked about national lockdowns, we didn't talk about geopolitical economy. Look at the trade wars and what that has done to between US and China as an example, right? So I think there's a greater recognition and pandemic, the health crisis. I think there's a greater recognition that there are things you will not have it in your control, and therefore the need for agility, flexibility has become quite important. And that's where I have a similar view as Lynn. I think you will see a greater balance and maybe a focus to go away from cost and cost alone, and balancing the need for the cost with the need to be able to meet the customer need. You can have higher profit, but you can have no profit if there is no supply, right? So this need for regionalization is going to come back. It might mean actually slightly higher prices, but maybe better availability, and maybe 70% will remain close to what it is. 30% will move. But you will see significant shifts in supply chain, in my assessment, to bring a balance from cost alone to now resilience.
Fascinating, Modi, fascinating. Almost like a cost plus type of world rather than just pure cost. But Lynn, before I ask Pramod as well, but Lynn, can I just ask you the how or the why of inflation for supply chain managers and people in the supply chain business? How does that cause people headaches? Is it just the uncertainty? Is it how does that cause people difficulties?
Yes, well, it's certainly the uncertainty of what inflation is going to do and how it's going to impact us. There's tools that we have in place within Flex to try and anticipate some of those changes before they happen, and looking at all of the raw commodities that we purchase and what we're seeing taking place. And in our case, a bit of the headache is we build products for other customers, so they're entrusting their supply chain to Flex. So it's a timing perspective to make sure we're aligned with our customers to understand what's taking place with our suppliers that we're working for, and ensuring that we're able to mitigate as much as we can, but then just be very open and transparent when those changes come to the price model with our customers.
Absolutely. Interesting. Pramod, before we get to solutions and ideas of collaboration, just in your work at GEP, working with clients, what are the inflation challenges? Is it very similar to what Modi and Lynn just spoke through? Are you seeing similar things just on the issue of inflation in supply chains?
Very much, and a lot of it has been accentuated by the shortages and also the pent-up demand that is, I think, causing a significant whiplash and in the supply chain itself, and so there is this sort of amplified sense of demand and certainly an amplified sense of supply shortages, which I think is contributing to the inflation as well. Modi, I really like what you said about the impact of that from a cost perspective, and then shift. What you were describing in terms of supply chains had been set up so perfectly to be lean and efficient, to be in a setup where you are leveraging the competitive advantages of different regions and markets, whether it's labor supply, whether it is sources of supply, material supply, or even a talent, supply. So that really defined the supply chains that we have lived with. And what that meant, in my view, is a supply chain that ended up being a bit rigid and lacking the flexibility. And now the push is with all the disruptions that we are dealing with and anticipate will continue to be in way of life for supply chain practitioners is this need and the shift from what I call from being cost efficient to being efficiently flexible. Right, you have to figure out how do you sort of reconfigure your supply chain that can provide you the flexibility and the nimbleness to move things around at a moment's notice. Companies are exploring redundancy in capacities, redundancy in their logistics flows, redundancy in people even, and so I think that does come at a cost. I do think there is perhaps a silver lining in all of that, is that the digital solutions and Industry 4.0 solutions can come to a bit of a rescue in terms of helping further drive and accelerate the operational efficiencies that perhaps had plateaued in the sort of the old way of pursuing lean and operations excellence. And with digital solutions, I think you can get to that next step change in operational performance, lower the cost, and certainly then fund and enable the supply chain with digital solutions and drive that flexibility. So yes, I think I agree with you that it's going to be a slightly next level cost plus setup, but I think in my views, digital solutions can certainly come to a rescue for maintaining the cost, or at least putting a lid on it, and still providing flexibility for the operations.
Can I
Interesting, Pramod, because
did
someone want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to build upon what Pramod said, right?
Please.
So I think one risk, we always carry, that is to be in this pendulum, right, where we overcorrect and we make ourselves uncompetitive. I'm talking about any company for that matter. And therefore, the need for surgical approach is really, really important, right? You don't want to so overdrive that suddenly you stand out and you end up replicating your manufacturing footprint, supply chain footprint. You replicate it around the world and you do so much of it. You've done a great job in resilience. You can supply within 3 days to any customer anything they want, but it comes at such a hefty price that you're no longer viable as a firm. You're not competitive, and others are undercutting you significantly day in, day after, right? So this need for balance, I think, is incredibly important, and the devil is in the detail, right? So there are things that are leveraging the technology, the way Pramod is saying, as well as there are certain things which are more long lead, and the need for flexibility is more important than other places, right? So I would just champion for being very thoughtful how we are building the resilience rather than just going, again overboard, and then at some point you're then being forced to correct the other way.
Moti, I couldn't agree with you more on that point. Often so many of my clients will come with that exact same, concern, is that, the idea of resiliency or flexibility in supply chain often, comes with a presumption that you need to overhaul your supply chain, that you need to sort of redo it. I couldn't agree with you more. It is, in my view, it's fine tuning, as I call it, right? You need to just, find those levers that will embed the right flexibility at the right nodes and flows of your supply chain, and make it work. I think it is just that. It is the refinement and fine tuning of it, not an overhaul, in my view.
Fascinating. Lynn, can I bring you in here? You started to go there 10 minutes or 20 minutes ago about collaboration, but now I just wanted to get into that particular point. To someone like me, it sounds positive. It sounds more conversation, understanding more of your suppliers, where they're at, etc. But But you're in the field, you're in the middle of it. What does enhanced collaboration, and why could collaboration be a really important part of the solution here?
Well, I found that through my entire career, collaborating with customers and suppliers has always been important. Sometimes it can be a bit adversarial when you have, competing goals that you're trying to achieve, but overall you build those relationships and you continue to work and learn and grow together. What I saw really, through COVID and again, through all these shortages is what I would phrase as intense collaboration in very thoughtful communications with our customers. Because we see the demand is very strong, we want to ensure we're very clearly understanding the potential impacts, because we have shortages, that are impacting all of our customers. We look at, when Flex may go line down, when our customer may go line down, get all of the details so that when we're working with our suppliers, we're giving them very transparent and specific information to keep our lines running, to keep our mutual customers satisfied. So that has really been, I think, extremely important over the past 2 years as we've managed through this. Just, data, providing the right level of data that can be actioned efficiently by the organizations we're working with, and ensuring a very clear understanding of the demand and the potential impacts. Because in a shortage situation, there's just not enough to go around. So, we're advocating on behalf of our customers, we're advocating on behalf of Flex, but we're being very honest with the information we're providing to our suppliers as we manage through that. And I believe that's been a very effective approach. And this isn't my first cycle that I've gone through in a shortage cycle in my career. You've gone through a couple in the past. And if we think about previous supply chain impacts that have had a dramatic impact, if you think about the floods in Thailand or the tsunami in Japan, there was a shock to the system, but it was relatively short in its duration. And we didn't see a fundamental change in our supply chains resulting from that. Now, as I see, it's been so impactful across every industry, every country in the world, impacting consumers around the world. As we look towards redesigning and re-engineering our global supply chains, I think Modi's point is very clear on that surgical approach. And I'm going to steal the efficiently flexible line as well, because I think those all come together. Really being very honest about what the needs are that are trying to be achieved, designing a supply chain that can manage that, and making sure as we're working with customers and suppliers, as we get through this time of disruption that we're experiencing now and into the future, trying to drive a new way in which to increase the transparency across the ecosystem so that we're able to understand earlier shifts in demand. At some point we may see a market correction where we see decreases in some of the demand. I'm also going to have to steal revenge spending, because that was a fantastic line. But as people emerge from COVID, is it going to be less spent on goods and services or goods for the home and more on, dinner and a movie and going out? Are we going to see a shift in spending habits that impact some of the products that we are expected to deliver? So I think that just being really driving more transparency and an understanding of true demand and how we can work together to achieve that across the entire ecosystem, because it's complex. You have, the OEMs on one side working with a company like Flex or some of our competitors to build their product, and we work direct with the suppliers or through distribution. And it's very complex when you have so many parties involved. So how can we get a better indication of true demand so we can all plan for that?
Interesting. Lynn, can I just stay with you for a second? So much interesting points there, but I just want to go back to, you said this is not your first cycle. So given the other periods, the other shocks were more short-term in nature, and this is a long shock, unfortunately, for everyone. Do you think this change now is more fundamental, compared to how people are viewing their supply chains and looking to make these efficiencies and take these surgical approaches. Do you feel like because of the duration of this shock compared to the other ones that you have worked through, does this feel like more of a fundamental change rather than what happened 5 or 10 years ago?
I do think we'll see a fundamental change, and I think it will be a focus on de-risking the supply chain. We've seen a number of times where a single point of failure can have a dramatic impact. And we talk about supply chain, it's also the design of the products themselves. In many cases, you have a unique part or a unique technology that's a single source device that comes from that's manufactured in one location in the world. So that needs to be addressed. You can't always, we can talk about dual sourcing when possible, but in some cases that's not really an option. So you look at, how do you build resiliency for that single device while you look at designing a supply chain to be more resilient. I think always having multi-sourcing options is important, especially when you're able to focus that where manufacturing takes place in different geographies. We always look at flex. We look to regionalize our suppliers wherever possible, where we have the talent and the requirements to be able to do that. And historically, that's typically focused on heavier products, the mechanical products, packaging, plastics. But understanding those intricacies of the supply chain and being very mindful of where you have a risk and then what can be done to mitigate that risk. Again, one size does not fit all. In some cases, it might mean holding a little bit of extra inventory, which obviously has a cost associated with it. But it doesn't always make sense to hold inventory for all of the devices that you're sourcing. So it is that very mindful approach of redesigning a supply chain with all of those elements in mind to achieve the goal of the organization.
Absolutely. Lynn, I want to bring the gentleman back in, but one more quick question for you. You mentioned the word regionalized. Can you briefly just sum up, why would regionalizing a supply chain or even part of a supply chain, what advantage would that give someone?
Well, and that's not a new concept that we've had. Many companies have looked at, you launch a product in a region and potentially scale it up to a certain amount of output that you're achieving. But in some cases, products, you want the final assembly or final manufacturing of your product closer to the end market, because that may result in shorter time to market, reduced logistics charges. We have an obvious benefit at Flex where we have facilities, all around the world to support exactly those options for our customers. And again, a centralized single manufacturing location can absolutely make the most sense for a customer depending upon what their end product is. While in some cases having multiple regionalized strategies, say a European and North American and an Asia strategy would make the most sense.
Right. Thank you, Lynn. Fantastic. Modi, I'm going to come back to Pramod in a minute, but Modi, can I come back to this collaboration point, which I think is really, really key and really important in today's discussion. But I wanted to ask, is collaboration, it must be easier with your first tier suppliers. And yes, we can use digital tools and communication, but is collaboration more difficult the further down you go in your supply chain, the further down you go in the tiers of your supply chain? How easy is this collaboration, Modi?
I would say that, I would like to include even customers, right? Because ultimately, if you pull your customers in and if you were to engage with them sooner in the process and earlier in the process, I think better off you're going to be to make sure that you know their true demand. You understand what the requirements are, and then you're making sure you're running the supply chain to meet your customer requirement. But I agree with you. Actually, further down the value chain you go, more important it gets, but yet more difficult it gets, right? So just visualize. My dream would be that you've got this a collaboration where multiple tiers together are collaborating on the customer requirement. And typically, I think all of you guys would agree with me, there is generally a widget or two, long lead time, constrained, that's really causing the problem. But the reason we are unable to solve the problem because there is lack of transparency of the requirement. And I would add second, which is go hand in hand, is trust, right? So there is a often in imperfect supply chains, you worry that you'll get 80% of what you ask for, so you ask for 120, so that you still get close to 100, right? So you pile on and you add on the requirements. So in the world where there is a multi-tier information visibility and a level of trust that is built in, I think a lot of this self-inflicted problem will go away, right? And there would be a better allocation done. But again, that comes with collaboration. It comes with a level of trust. And I would add maybe last tools, right? You need to have the right capability and right tools that allows you to understand where to go focus. So to me, in addition to the physical supply changes that Lynn already talked about, I think that would be required to a degree, and I would call it fine tuning or surgical approach, but not massive. There is place for collaboration. There is a place for trust.
Absolutely. Interesting, Modi. Pramod, I want to bring you in here on this collaboration point. You must see a lot in your work from GEP's perspective, but I wanted to ask about your views on collaboration. Is there a sense, is there an encouraging sense of collaboration, or some issues with trust, some lack of trust? How do you see this area of collaboration, Pramod?
So I think trust is the underpinning of collaboration, and the reason why companies and their suppliers have not been able to share data. There is an element of trust in sort of giving up too much information to your customers, and likewise to your suppliers, right? And that could come back to you. And so I think that has to be overcome, at some level. But from a collaboration perspective, I do think I agree with Lynn. One size does not fit all. You need to identify your strategic partners, your critical suppliers, and you create that bridge of trust with them first. I don't personally think that you need to go down to tier 2, tier 3 levels. Certainly, where it is important to recognize that you might be fighting for a source of supply, for a supply source that is being drawn by multiple tier 1 suppliers. So that tier 2 supplier becomes a critical player in your supply chain equation. So one has to take a sort of a review of your supply chain to really understand where are the breakpoints in your supply chain and what will turn into a potential risk. So again, it's a segmented approach. It is a select approach in terms of where you want to build your collaboration. But generally, I do agree with both Modi and Lynn, is that there is a need to share more information with your suppliers and also with your consumers and customers, because the demand surge that we are experiencing could be perhaps much more calibrated if we were able to get that point of sale information much more real time. And avoid the bullwhip effect in the supply chain itself. So absolutely, I think there is a permanent place for sharing data, collaborating in planning, collaborating in response to a disruption. I think will be a way of working for our clients. I do also want to make one point, we talk about resiliency, and Modi, as you said, resiliency comes at a cost. And the essential question is, how much resiliency is enough for an organization, for a company? And typically, at GP, we calculate the resiliency in ability to respond or cover supply or cover your customers over a period of time. So that, if a disruption were to hit, can I cover my supply for the next 10 days, or can I cover it for the next 3 weeks. So to me, we need to start thinking about in that terms, because and determine how far do you want to go, right? How far do you want to protect your supply chain, and recognize that it's going to come with a cost of capital, cost of technology enablement, and so that, in my mind, can help frame the right level of collaboration and right level of resiliency you want to embed in your supply chain.
Fascinating, Pramod. Can I just push you on that point, because I find it so interesting, Pramod? Focusing on resilience, and as you said, can you cover for 5 days? Can you cover for 10 days? But when I think about risk, as I do in my job, looking at the global economy and globalization and global trade, the risks are almost endless. And I guess what fascinates me about what you're talking about is, how does a company choose the risks? How do they understand which risk that I want to be resilient for? Because I guess it depends on your sector and your geography and your markets, but this takes time, takes planning, probably takes some money. But how do people think about risk? What risks do people, how do they go through that decision-making process to find the right risks to be resilient for, Pramod?
So typically, the conversation around risk would have been traditionally tackled in a sales and operations planning process of a business, where you would bring forward risk associated with supply and risk of demand as well, in terms of not hitting the expectations. They would get discussed and sorted out on that platform, in that forum. What has surfaced now as a need and a necessity is to start paying attention to risks that you may not have paid attention to, pre-COVID, right? So if there was a political unrest taking place in some part of the world, one would ignore it typically and say that, okay, well, that will not affect me, or perhaps it's too far down the horizon that I don't need to worry about it. I know a client of mine firsthand. They go through this process of sensing risk, both short-term, medium, and long-term, whether it is through news, whether it is through weather reports, whether it is through observing how suppliers and how markets are dealing with. They are bringing that information together on practically daily basis to think about what can happen and make appropriate adjustments. And adjustments, again, you have only a handful of levers left at your disposal in the short term. You can redeploy your inventory, you can reconfigure the flows of your material flows in your supply chain. So what I'm seeing clients invest in is a capability, what I call is sense and respond, that you are able to have this radar up that will allow you to bring intelligence from your environment that could be disruptive, understanding risk and picking those risk signals early on, and then disposing that risk in your organization to take appropriate actions in your supply chain to be able to respond to it. So a capability which is sense and respond capability, as I would call it, is becoming a priority for many clients, particularly larger clients with over thousands of suppliers, global supply chains. I think they are investing significantly in that capability.
Can I build upon that? So I would say one thing at Ericsson we do. One thing we do at Ericsson when we think about how to prioritize where to build resilience, we look at substitution time, right? So if situations are going to come, right? So it's a matter of time which one. Now we got health crisis. We talked about factory fires, and we talked about logistics issues, Suez Canal. So you just don't know what would come to you when. So it's more how would you respond and how long would it take for you to respond. So if something is going to take 3 weeks versus it's going to take 3 months, or is it going to take 9 months, right? So if it's going to take a long time, I think that's the first one you may want to prioritize and do something with, because you are bringing your business to a halt. right? You're bringing your customers to a halt, right? But if you can do something in few days or a week or three, depending on what industry and kind of products that you're dealing with, you may choose to. So at least the way we think about this, we go from longest lead time for substitution to the shortest, and we start at the top because that one component or set of components has a cascading impact on your entire organization and so many customers globally. That's another nuance that we apply to make sure that we take the right decisions in terms of applying the right resources or limited resources to work on a vital few.
Reacting to the disruption is really what we've all gotten very good at, right? When it's one after another, it's how quickly you can touch on that. And one of the talking points everybody has is how to digitalize your supply chain. And, I'm very fortunate at Flex. We created our digital supply chain in 2015. It's called Pulse. And we've been innovating and investing ever since. And that has been an incredibly powerful tool to do exactly what you were just describing. When an event hits, with our system, we have one source of data. So everybody around the world has the same information accessible to them at their fingertips. And throughout the early days of COVID and now whenever we have a significant impact, we'll pull together my global team very quickly. Typically, it's about 5:30 in the morning my time because it's a global group and I'm in California. But we come together and we'll make our decisions and we'll utilize our Pulse system to be able to ensure everybody understands what action needs to be taken. We have about 10,000 supply chain professionals at Flex. So we'll make a decision and then are able to deploy all of our resources to execute on that. And in many times, then we'll get together the next day to have a follow-up discussion to see the progress we've made. So I think to your point, Modi, being able to respond, and then like what I've experienced is the benefit of a digitalized supply chain that you're able to keep track of your entire global organization and identify those longer term issues that need people to be focused on in the immediate term to resolve.
Thank you, Lynn. Pramod, you want to jump in as well?
No, I was just, I'm pleased to hear, Lynn, about Pulse and that it's working for Flex. It is a capability that I know so many of our clients, GEP's clients, are looking to stand up. So that's fantastic to hear.
Thank you both. Can I just zoom out for a second because we're coming towards the end of our great discussion. But I wanted to ask about free trade. I work for the Economist Group, obviously. I now work for Economist Impact within the Economist Group. But the whole group in the magazine or newspaper in particular was founded on this belief in the benefits of free trade. But do we need a bigger conversation about, it feels to me, looking at global trade right now, we need a bigger conversation as well about restoring trust in global trade. And unfortunately, I see too many risks coming on the horizon that people like yourselves have to deal with. Geopolitics is now a much bigger factor in the global economy than probably was maybe 10 years ago. Unfortunately, climate change and the impacts of climate change are now becoming more serious over time. But it feels to me, unfortunately, like a lot of governments, even big markets that may have believed in free trade, are starting to pull back a little bit and think about strategic goods, strategic supply chains, and all of that just pushes against the notions of free trade and allowing companies to move their supply chains and look wherever in the world. So, Modi, is this a bigger conversation that we should also be having about maybe restoring trust at government level as well as company level about global trade?
I honestly, it's a question. I'm going to agree with you, right? I think that free trade is the only way to go, right? And as much as we talked about, how it creates global supply chains and interdependence and the risks it creates, the need for resilience, those to me are tweaks that we need to do to make sure that we are thoughtful. But the underpinning economy needs to be far more global, and anything different, right? We frankly end up causing artificial inflation. We end up not leveraging the best technology. We create parallel supply chains, and we are not leveraging each other's strength, and we are not leveraging each other's R&D, because we are living in a cocoon, and we are trying to protect our own economy. So to me, I think the underpinning for the world, for consumers, and for positive competition, it needs to be free trade, right? But then to manage for supply chain professionals, the drawbacks of global supply chains, or the risks that we talk about, the unknowns, and so on and so forth, those request tweaks. But the underpinning needs to be global supply chains. It's good for consumers, it's good for economy, it's good for competition. It drives the best in the countries as well, right? So when a particular country is doing outstanding, it inspires other countries to do better, right? And let the best country, best set of people, best ideas win. When you artificially put constraints, these are artificial end of the day, right? And you don't let the best survive, and it becomes very managed economy. And I would argue over time, you're taking the same amount of money and you're investing in the same set of ideas, versus on one set of ideas, then the other countries trying to build upon those ideas and making it better. So I'm a big proponent personally of open trade, free trade.
Excellent. Well, maybe we set up another webinar. We can discuss that another day.
That'd be lovely. That would be lovely.
Very close to my heart. But listen, we're coming towards the end. We've covered so many great areas. We started off talking about the disruptions, the issues in the supply chain, end on demand, COVID, but not just COVID, it's been coming beforehand. In the last 20 or 25 minutes, you've all been sharing ideas about solutions, collaboration, digital tools, digitalizing the supply chains, fine-tuning rather than maybe fundamentally changing supply chains. The great phrase, efficiently flexible, was mentioned a couple of times, which is fantastic. But in the last few minutes, if I can just start with Lynn, maybe then come across to the gentleman. But a key takeaway, Lynn, after all this great discussion, what's one thing that you really want to make sure our audience take away from today's discussion? What would you tell them?
I would say, we have experienced unprecedented time over the past 2 years, and especially in supply chain, it's been very challenging. And I think as an ecosystem, we've risen to those challenges to continue to manufacture and produce goods. And as we hopefully, stabilize a bit over the next 12 to 18 months, I really hope that there's a continuation to look at how we can come together and work more efficiently and effectively and transparently to enable better solutions for the future that help us prevent something like this from happening in the future. And so that's kind of my wish for the audience. It's a big ask, but I do think there are fundamental ways we can change how we manage our global supply chains that can be beneficial to everyone in the world. And that's what I want to continue the focus on.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lynn. Thanks so much for your contribution. Modi, I want to leave Pramod to last, but Modi, a key takeaway, a last thought for the audience.
I think two takeaways, at least for me, right? So one, I would say, I think moving away from pure supply chain efficiency to resilience, but doing tweaks, not overhaul. I think it's clearly one, so that we bring the right balance, and then we do something that's sustainable. And second would be collaboration and trust, right? It's so evident that if we can make minor tweaks and then we build greater trust and collaboration, I think together we will make supply chains better. We will remain efficient, we will remain competitive, and I think we'll serve our customers better together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Marty, and thanks for your great conversation today. Last but not least, Pramod, last word. What's a key takeaway from you today after our fantastic discussion?
I agree with everything, Lynn, you said, Moti, what you said in terms of, future of supply chain, and certainly what's important to be successful in the post-COVID world. And in my mind, the key takeaway for me and the key sort of word that's going to be overused in the next decade is collaboration across the supply chain, and not just the enterprise at the enterprise level, but really at the value chain level. And I would say this, that the solutions and technology platforms that we have been so entrenched with, perhaps are not, may not, serve us well, or perhaps are limiting that collaboration itself. And I think there is a need to think about a more configurable solution that would allow for these interfaces to be established with your supply chain ecosystem partners, both downstream as well as upstream, so that you can share data more efficiently and exchange ideas and resolutions to supply chain disruptions and risk that will continue to hit us in the future. So I think that, to me, collaboration is going to be the key, and how you sort of prepare for it is important as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pramod. Thanks so much. I think you've all shared some really great insight. I have pages of notes of scribble here. I'll try and read later, but I really think our audience will get a lot out of this discussion, and would have got a lot out of this discussion. But all that's left for me to do now is to thank Modi, Pramod, Lynn for your great insight. I really want to thank the audience for joining us, and I really hope I do believe they got a lot out of it. And also I'd like to thank my Economist Impact colleagues behind the scenes who helped set all this up. I really, really appreciate all the hard work. But wherever you're joining us and have joined us from today, I hope you stay well, take care. And at Economist Impact, we look forward to joining you again next time. And also to thank GEP as well for sponsoring and supporting this webinar. We really appreciate the support. But thanks again for joining us. Thanks again to a fantastic panel. And wherever you are, take care, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks, everyone.